and Tanya Sillam and Jane Bennett-Powell in the studios for Channel 4 News.
Paratrooper Private Lee Clegg is freed from jail. Rioting erupts in Northern Ireland. Good evening. The paratrooper Lee Clegg has been freed from Wakefield jail after serving almost 4 years of a life sentence for the shooting of the Belfast teenager Karen Reilly. In West and North Belfast, cars have been set alight in protest. But as Dublin calls for equal treatment for Loyalist and Republican prisoners, Downing Street says it won't damage the peace process. We examine how a highly organised establishment campaign secured Clegg's release and why it provoked some of the most violent demonstrations since the start of the ceasefire. The paratrooper Private Lee Clegg has been freed from Wakefield jail to the delight of campaigners for his early release and to the fury of both nationalist and Republican communities in Northern Ireland. Private Clegg, who'd served almost 4 years of a life sentence for the shooting of a teenage girl, Karen Reilly, at a Belfast checkpoint, said he now hoped to resume a full military career. Tonight he's celebrating with his family after a reunion at Catterick Barracks. Liz Donnelly reports on the events leading up to Clegg's release and how a coordinated campaign by the military establishment secured his freedom.
After a massive campaign to secure his release, Private Lee Clegg, whose life sentence for murder had been confirmed by both the appeal court and the House of Lords, walked free today.
Don't sound like it. Give us a big smile. Oh, lovely.
Private Clegg, posing for the cameras, declined to answer questions, perhaps because of the sensitivity of his case. Instead, he issued a written statement saying he was delighted to be free and hoped to resume a full military career. At a news conference, his lawyer described the reunion between Private Clegg and his family.
In turn, every member of his family embraced him, hugged him tightly, broke down into tears. Private Clegg himself broke down, and it was so full of emotion that no one, I think, frankly, had the energy to speak.
Private Clegg was among those who opened fire on this car as it sped through an army checkpoint, driven by a joyrider. Karen Reilly, a passenger in the car, died from shots in her back fired by Private Clegg. The court found that the first 3 shots from Private Clegg were fired in self-defence, but the 4th was fired when the car was driving away and so not a threat. 100 MPs were among those who joined the huge campaign to free Private Clegg after his appeal was dismissed by the House of Lords. Veteran paratroopers also backed him as one of their own, and a petition signed by 2 million people was handed into Downing Street. Julian Brazier, one of the MPs who led the campaign, said he was delighted by Clegg's release.
I think that the fact that the public made it so very clear, as indeed did colleagues on both sides of the House, I think did illustrate very clearly to the Secretary of State and to the Northern Ireland office that many people felt that a breach of natural justice had occurred.
The campaign was driven by the national press. The Daily Telegraph was the first to take up Clegg's case. On the 13th of January, with the headline "From British Soldier to Murderer," in a split second, it told his story. The Mail and the Sun joined in. The Daily Mail printing a petition for readers to send to John Major, and the Sun printing Lee's brave letter to all his supporters. The Daily Telegraph editor makes clear his paper never argued that Clegg was innocent.
Many people who have to do with armies and wars and terrorist situations recognise that if you put large numbers of very young men in possession of lethal weapons, that terrible mistakes are going to be made. They always have been made, they always will be made. Now, in our opinion, those concerned should be punished, so that's not an issue. It's a question of whether the level of punishment matches the level of the misdeed. In Private Clegg's case, we felt that we didn't.
On the 6th of June, the Northern Ireland Life Sentence Review Board met to review the case. 3 days later, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland received the Review Board's recommendations. Sir Patrick Mayhew decided on Clegg's release last Wednesday. The Labour chairman of the Northern Ireland Select Committee, Clive Soley, welcomed the news, but called on the government to free other prisoners who've been recommended for release.
I've no problem about Private Clegg being released. I think he is one of many victims of the Northern Ireland Troubles. I think the problem is that this will be perceived as a double standard in Northern Ireland. Whatever they chose this time, I don't know why, but I'll tell you this, everybody in Ireland, and indeed many people in this country, will assume it was just political expediency in the battle for the leadership of the Tory party. It's crazy.
Lee Clegg! 4 years! Irish POW! 20 years!
As protesters gathered outside Parliament, Downing Street described accusations that the release was connected to the leadership election as utter rubbish. It was a matter for the Northern Ireland Secretary to decide himself. The Prime Minister was, it said, not consulted but informed.
Liz Donnelly reporting. Well, Downing Street has said Clegg's release should cause no conceivable damage to the peace process. But the Irish Prime Minister, John Bruton, said he expected the British authorities to apply the same approach to all other similar prisoner cases, both Loyalist and Republican. In Northern Ireland, there were violent scenes in Republican areas of West and North Belfast, with cars hijacked and set on fire, and a member of the Life Sentence Review Board, which recommended Private Clegg's release, has now resigned in protest. Alex Thompson reports from Belfast on the furious reaction to today's controversial move and the implications for the future of the peace process.
Sinn Féin says the release of Private Clegg has the most serious implications possible for the peace process. And on the streets of West Belfast, it was back to the old days. From mid-morning, gangs hijacked and burned vehicles, creating barricades across nationalist areas. The writing's on the wall for the British government. It's on hijacked vehicles, on advertising hoardings, that unless there is urgent movement towards releasing paramilitary prisoners as well as military prisoners, the outlook for the peace process looks grim.
The reaction amongst the nationalist opinion, not just here in the north but throughout the island, would be one of great anger and a belief once again that British justice is a two-tier system, one for those who wear the British uniform and for secondly and definitely for Irish people.
Orderly protests outside Belfast High Court by those who also sense double standards. In Londonderry, protesters burned British tabloid newspapers which campaigned to free Clegg, a campaign which has left the father of Karen REILLY, the girl Clegg murdered, quite bewildered.
We've lost Karen. He took her away from us. He buried her beneath this big steamroller of a campaign that was orchestrated on his behalf. He sullied her name, tried to sully mine, my wife's.
In the Falls, a lorry load of milk cartons is hijacked. The anger on the streets shared by one of the women who was also in the stolen car with Karen REILLY when she was shot by Private Lee Clegg.
There's Paul Norney. He's gone until his 21st year in an English prison. He was 17 and he was only convicted of conspiring to plant explosives, and he's done 21 years. Lee Clegg went out and shot dead an 18-year-old wee girl, and 2 years later he's out, probably going to go on holiday. He's back in the army. He was never put out in the army.
The release of Private Clegg is seen in Republican areas as clear evidence of dual standards of justice, and they've reacted accordingly. The streets of West and North Belfast have seen the worst rioting and civil disturbance in 10 months of ceasefire.
Even Irish nationalists who abhor violence feel betrayed by the release, and the sense of the British establishment looking after its own runs deep here.
The Secretary of State will put all sorts of legal angles onto it, but I'm not a lawyer, but you don't have to be very bright to realise that the issues are related in terms of prisoners. And as I said, it's not a perception to the people of my constituency, it is a fact that you have one set of rules for soldiers and another set for ordinary people.
When do you want it? Hey!
This afternoon, Sinn Féin mounted a protest march to press for the release of paramilitary prisoners, a demand incidentally shared by many loyalists.
Well, I think the British could diffuse the situation greatly by immediately returning the 34 prisoners in England. If they claim jurisdiction over this part of Ireland, then there's absolutely no reason why they can't move them to a prison here. That would be seen as going some way to diffusing the situation.
Concern too among civil servants about the way Clegg's release was handled. Briege Gadd of the Northern Ireland Probation Service has resigned in protest, saying it was a major deviation from previous procedures. 10 months into the ceasefire, over 150 vehicles hijacked in Belfast, 2 bomb hoaxes, and the sight again of RUC officers mounting road checks and having to put on flak jackets. But according to one unionist MP, the campaign to release Clegg was justified.
Those campaigns have gone on for years in other situations, and when they have been successful, immediately it's a victorious shout. But when it's done in the case of a servant of the Crown, that's a crime in the eyes of the nationalist community.
Their disgust is obvious, but there'll now be increased pressure from Dublin on the British government to agree a way forward on the prisoners issue and the peace process generally, which today came close to appearing like a sham. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Belfast.
Well, we're joined now from Londonderry by Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin. Martin McGuinness, this is exactly the kind of violence that you must condemn in order to show your commitment to the peace process.
No, I think I have shown, and Sinn Féin has shown, its commitment to the peace process over the recent years. We have worked very hard indeed with many other people to put in place a peace process which would have as its goal all-party talks leading to an eventual solution. And that has not happened. And in reality, what we have seen is this British government throwing back in our faces everything that has been achieved as a result of the ceasefire.
But what are you doing to reduce tension on the streets of Londonderry where you are now, and even Belfast? I mean, you saw there in that report hijackings of commercial vehicles. This is exactly your opportunity to show your commitment to peace and indeed to the IRA ceasefire.
We have shown our commitment to peace, and the question isn't what I can do. The question is, what is the British government prepared to do? And what we have seen over the course of the last 10 months is a British government which hasn't taken this peace process seriously, which has thrown the peace process back into our faces tonight, and the situation has been exacerbated today as a result of this disgraceful and despicable decision by the British government to protect one of its own.
But the SDLP and the Irish government have both exercised their objections to Private Clegg's release. Your situation, surely, is that you must be seen to condone violence.
Sinn Féin doesn't condone violence of any
to object
description.
to violence, I'm sorry.
Sinn Féin doesn't condone violence, and Sinn Féin has worked very hard indeed, and we have taken more risks than anybody else, more than the British Prime Minister, more than Patrick Mayhew. We are the people who have stuck our necks out in this process. And what have we seen today? We have seen the British government throwing that back, not just in our faces, but in the face of the Dublin Prime Minister, John Bruton, back in the face of John Hume, back in the face of people like John Alderdice and others who have worked hard to initiate all-party peace talks. What we have to see here, and Dick Spring hit the nail on the head today, we have to see the British government recognising that a very grave situation lies before us, which can only be remedied and resolved by a very wholehearted move by this British government to move to the negotiating table. And we all recognise that at this point in time, the British Conservative Party are that busy fighting with one another that the least concern that they have at this point in time is for us and the peace process in Ireland. But this British government needs to recognise the seriousness of the situation and move on as soon as they resolve their difficulties to resolve what is the most important issue between the British and the Irish people, and that is those issues which go to the heart of this conflict, which can only be resolved at the negotiating table.
Martin McGuinness, thank you for joining us from Londonderry.
Thank you.
Evening. There was widespread fury in nationalist areas of Northern Ireland today after the paratrooper Lee Clegg walked from Wakefield prison a free man. Anger about the decision to release him has left the peace process facing its most severe test yet. Dozens of vehicles were hijacked and set on fire, and thousands of protesters took to the street demanding the reciprocal release of Republican prisoners. Private Lee Clegg had served 4 years of a life sentence for shooting and killing Karen Reilly, a passenger in a stolen car. Our Northern Ireland correspondent Tom Bradley reports from Belfast.
After 4 years in jail, Private Lee Clegg is now free. For his supporters, it has been too long. For his detractors, not long enough. But today, he looked relaxed as he posed for photographers after a tearful private reunion with his family. Despite the years in prison, Clegg still looked like a soldier. He smiled but said nothing.
How do you feel, Lee? How do you feel?
Later, in a statement, he said he was delighted to be free and wanted to continue his career in the army, though for the moment his future is unclear. Tonight, his mother spoke for the first time since his release.
It was I think a bit shocked, if you like, you know, that it's finally happened in being released. We just sat around sort of talking, and we're glad to see him, and it was nice to be able to sit and relax in a room without people walking about over you and that.
But if Clegg's family and friends were delighted, in Belfast today felt like a step back in time. Republicans took their anger to the streets. They believe John Major has released Lee Clegg to boost his chances in tomorrow's leadership election. Republicans have always argued that decisions impacting on Ireland are all too often affected by the narrow politics of Westminster. They see this as a cynical gesture, an example of the British establishment reaching out to protect its own. Away from the demonstrations, the father of the girl Lee Clegg murdered was suffering quietly.
I feel very disappointed and very bitter that he's been released. I think this flew in the face of everything that's went before. Nothing adds up in my mind at the moment. I don't think it ever will add up. I feel robbed of justice.
And whilst many of their supporters were out on the streets, the leaders of Sinn Féin were saying this had seriously damaged the peace process. Irish government ministers were also annoyed. They now want some IRA prisoners to be released.
I think it is important that the law would be seen to be implemented in a fair manner right across the board. And I think the prisoners, many of them, will be very concerned at the implications of this case, as opposed to the treatment that they have been receiving for many, many years.
This is probably only a temporary hitch in the peace process, but the IRA retains the capacity to return to violence, and there is a feeling that the British may not really be serious about making the process work. Sinn Féin's leaders are likely to push still harder for the release of IRA prisoners, and the graffiti this afternoon contained a simple message: Clegg out, all out. Tom Bradby, News at 10 in Belfast.
Republicans expressed their disgust at Private Lee Clegg's release on the streets of Belfast and Derry. Over 100 vehicles were hijacked and set alight. In the worst incident, a lorry driver had flammable liquid poured down his throat after refusing to hand over the keys to a masked gang, claiming to be from the IRA. They threatened to blow his head off if he didn't cooperate. There were also a spate of bomb alerts, including this one at RUC headquarters.
This was a carefully planned and well orchestrated campaign. It certainly was not something that happened spontaneously, and no doubt it was geared to cause maximum disruption to city life and maximum damage to property.
West Belfast MP Joe Hendren agreed that the violence was orchestrated, a claim denied by Sinn Féin, who had organised several peaceful protests in the morning.
I put it down to simply the fact that a lot of people in this community are seething. 10 months into an area ceasefire, the British government have not released one single prisoner, and here we have Lee Clegg released this morning in the way in which he was released. So there's undoubtedly a lot of anger in these streets, and I wouldn't suggest for 1 minute that any of this is orchestrated at all.
While Lee Clegg's family celebrated his release from Wakefield Prison just 2 years into a life sentence, Karen Riley's father said he had been robbed of justice.
I don't think that it was right. I feel very disappointed and very bitter that he's been released. I think this flew in the face of everything that's went before. Nothing adds up in my mind at the moment. I don't think it ever will add up. I feel robbed of justice.
Markovich Gorman was in the car driven by Martin Peake and was also injured.
There's been people here convicted of less than murder and have spent years. It's just, the system's just not fair. He was a British soldier. He was here supposedly to uphold the law, not to murder children. There's been enough children murdered, and he's just, for the families that their friends and relatives have been murdered, this is just like rubbing salt in the wounds. There's supposedly going to be peace. There can be no peace when murderers are getting out of jail after serving 2 years.
Within hours of the government's decision to release Lee Clegg, the province's chief probation officer, Breach Gad, had resigned. Joe Hendren was quick to express his anger at the nature of the campaign to release the paratrooper.
It was Rule Britannia, our boys at the front can do no harm. Old colonels and brigadiers being dragged out and coming forward. There's even people whom I've always suspected, like Vera Lynn, lending her support to this. These were people who didn't even look at the circumstances of that fateful night when Karen Riley and Martin Peake were killed.
The message scrawled on this wall in West Belfast is clear: Clegg out, all out. But Ian Paisley says he agrees with the Secretary of State's decision, and Lee Clegg's case can't be acquitted with IRA prisoners. As night falls in Belfast, the violence continues. Burning cars and vans still litter the streets. These are scenes reminiscent of the Troubles, scenes many hoped they would never witness again.
Good evening. As frustration quickly turned to fury and violence, there were sickeningly familiar scenes in Northern Ireland. Was Private Lee Clegg's release timed to bolster John Major, or could it ironically destroy the initiative of which he is most proud? Sinn Féin responds to accusations it orchestrated today's violence, and two opposing views on today's release and what the fallout will be. First tonight, as Sinn Féin stood accused by both the RUC and the SDLP MP Joe Hendren of involvement in today's disturbances, it said it was a case of one law for Private Clegg and another for Republican prisoners. The release after 4 years of a life sentence for the murder of Karen Reilly has set off a stream of violence across Republican areas of Northern Ireland. The Irish Prime Minister John Bruton has called for all other similar prisoner cases to be treated the same. Downing Street described as utter rubbish suggestions that the timing was connected to the Tory leadership battle. Sporadic outbreaks of violence continue. In Belfast, cars and vans were hijacked and set alight across nationalist areas, and tonight the RUC seized 100 petrol bombs in the Republican Ardoyne area. In Derry there were similar attacks, and in Lurgan a railway track was set on fire. Lee Clegg himself appeared before the cameras this morning and released a statement saying he was delighted to be out and hoped to carry on with his military career. Miriam O'Callaghan reports from Northern Ireland on reactions to his release.
Scenes of street violence earlier today in Republican areas of North and West Belfast. Over 100 cars, lorries and vans were hijacked and later set on fire. The mood was so hostile, even camera crews were targeted.
Lads, give us a break.
This violence was all in protest at the release of Lee Clegg. Private Clegg spent the day at Catterick Army Base, where he was taken after his release from Wakefield Prison at 6:30 this morning. He had only served 2 years of a life sentence for murder. It was in 1990 that Karen Reilly, a 17-year-old Belfast girl, was shot dead by Clegg. She was joyriding with friends when they allegedly broke through a temporary roadblock. At Belfast Crown Court in 1993, Clegg was found guilty of using excessive force and was convicted of murder. Karen Reilly's father was distraught at today's decision.
We still lift our tongue and we'll serve our life sentence. And we'll go and visit Karen's grave daily, weekly, whatever. And I don't think there's ever going to be an end to that. Lee Clegg saw that.
Today, the only Northern Ireland Office minister willing to say anything justified the release and dismissed any dangers for the peace initiative.
It has little bearing on the peace process. We want politicians of all parties to get involved in substantial talks, and this particular case should be viewed as a one-off, but judged on the merits of the individual case and not as any political decision.
It's extremely unusual, however, for a life prisoner to be released after just 2 years. Usually prisoners have to serve a minimum of 10 years before their cases will even be considered for review by the Life Sentence Review Board. The only other case involved another soldier, Private Ian Fain, who was also released early. Today, one of Northern Ireland's most senior probation officers, Breach Gadd, resigned from the Life Sentence Review Board over the decision to release Lee Clegg. A protest march this afternoon in nationalist West Belfast. The talk here was of a dual system of justice, one for the English and one for the Irish.
The British government were warned. They were warned by everyone in Ireland that there would be an adverse reaction to the peace process if Clegg was released in isolation. Now, this is the adverse reaction. It's putting unnecessary pressure on the peace process.
In deciding to release Lee Clegg early, the government was fully aware of the anger and resentment this decision would create in nationalist areas. The two nationalist parties, the SDLP and Sinn Féin, and the Irish government had all warned the British about the possible implications of today's release. A source close to the Irish government told me earlier today that they are furious, as they had no prior warning of the decision and there's no quid pro quo for the release of other prisoners. The critical question now is what effect today's events may have on the moves here towards a permanent peace. Although today's anger on the streets was real, it's widely believed that most of the civil disobedience was orchestrated by well-known Republicans, some in Sinn Féin, some in the IRA. Tonight, the RUC said that senior Sinn Féin representatives were present at most of the trouble spots. But emotions are running high, and most nationalists didn't need to be led to feel bitterly angry about the release. Breach Norney's husband Paul, who was a member of the IRA, was sentenced to life imprisonment for attempted murder when he was only 17. He had served 20 years, is based in an English prison, which makes it difficult to visit him, and there's no word of a release date.
Lee Clegg was a trained para. He was on the streets of Belfast. He murdered a 17-year-old Irish girl. Lee Clegg, when he was sentenced, was transferred immediately so his family could visit him. Paul has been consistently refused transfer over. I mean, the inconsistencies, the vindictiveness towards the Irish prisoners compared to the way Lee Clegg has been treated has just made me furious.
Loyalists, although believing that Lee Clegg should never have been charged with murder in the first place, were also concerned today about the decision.
It has been our argument with government for quite some time that there needs to be movement on prisoners, because the prisoners indeed in many ways were kernel to the calling of a ceasefire in the first place.
Sources close to the Irish government say that the Irish Prime Minister John Bruton pleaded with John Major not to release Lee Clegg. It's a particularly sensitive time in the moves towards a permanent peace. Political progress is effectively deadlocked over the decommissioning of arms issue, and the Irish government is genuinely concerned that an event like today's release could unravel the whole process.
Well, we are concerned at the implications of it. We expressed those concerns to the British government, both Taoiseach and myself, at recent meetings. What we're concerned about is the fact that the law has to be seen to be impartial and to be carried out in such a manner as everybody gets equal treatment.
Today's disturbances, although sparked off by Lee Clegg's release, were primarily the result of mounting disaffection within Republican circles to the peace initiative. The hope is that these disturbances are merely a symbolic protest and don't amount to any real threat to a return to the violence of the past.
That report by Miriam McCallaghan, and as we speak there are still disturbances in North and West Belfast. I'm joined now from Northern Ireland by Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness. Joe Hendron of the SDLP accused Sinn Féin of orchestrating today's scenes. RUC have said there were well-known Sinn Féin people present at most of the disturbances. Do you deny Sinn Féin involvement in today's disturbances?
Yes, I do, absolutely. But it is a fact that Sinn Féin people were there on the ground at the protests which took place in both Derry and in Belfast. They cannot be blamed for what happened afterwards. The reality is that the chief responsibility for what has happened in both Belfast and Derry today lies clearly at 10 Downing Street. The British government is the government which took the decision to release Lee Clegg. They decided to elevate him above all the other prisoners, over 1,000 prisoners in prison as a result of the conflict in Ireland. They extracted him out for their own purposes, but to protect their own. And this has come 10 months after an Irish cessation, when there has been no indication whatsoever from the British government that it intends to either initiate all-party peace talks or to release any prisoners.
But given what's actually happening on the streets of North and West Belfast tonight, and given what you say is Sinn Féin's influence among the people and support among the people, will tonight you make a plea for no more trouble on the streets of Belfast? Will you now tonight tell people to go home?
Well, Sinn Féin hasn't condoned anything which has happened today in either Belfast or in Derry.
So you actively condemn what happened today?
Well, the only people I am prepared to condemn tonight, Kirsty, is the British government, because the people responsible for what happened on the streets in the 6 counties today is the British government. This is a British government which has done nothing in 10 months of the peace process to give people hope that there would be some opportunity through all-party peace negotiations to resolve all the very serious issues which are at the heart of this conflict.
Well, picking up on a point in Miriam McCallaghan's film about the repatriation of paramilitary prisoners. Can I just pick up one final point with you?
Kirsty, they have compounded all of that today by releasing a convicted murderer.
Can I pick up with Miriam McCallaghan's point on the 34 paramilitary prisoners?
Can I answer your question? Because I should be allowed to make my point. This is the second British soldier to be convicted of murder. 500 Irish civilians in the course of the last 25 years have been killed by 500 British soldiers. So what we're seeing here is double standards and hypocrisy of the worst kind from the British government. And if condemnations are to be handed out in Ireland today, let them be laid where the responsibility lies at 10 Downing Street.
Very briefly on a simple point which I want to put to you. The paramilitary prisoners that are on this side of the water, if they were repatriated to prisons in Northern Ireland, wouldn't that view, your view, would that be a start?
They should be repatriated as of right, not as part of bartering. What we need is a British government to recognise that almost 1 year into an IRA cessation, what people want to see is all the parties coming to the negotiating for all party talks. And so far the British government have denied that to the people. In fact, we are now going to see a convicted murderer walk straight back into the British Army and be handed back his rifle. So there's no decommissioning for Lee Clegg.
Martin McGuinness, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm joined now from Westminster by Ivan Lawrence of the Home Affairs Select Committee, and indeed back in Northern Ireland, in Derry, by the SDLP leader, John Hume. John Hume, first of all, tonight, picking up on Joe Hendron's accusation of Sinn Féin involvement. Do you agree with him?
Well, I have no evidence to support that at all. What I do know from my experience in my own streets today, just meeting people, was their deep, and I'm talking about people who weren't involved in any form of trouble, but they came to me to express their deep anger. And what is quite amazing, look, wouldn't you think that a government that is governing a place that have been through so much suffering as the people of Northern Ireland, and that now that we at last have 10 months of peace in our streets and so much joy among the people, would at least be sensitive to the situation. And yet, look at the insensitivity at this point of time, which is not just a sensitive period in the peace process, it's also the beginning of the marching season in Northern Ireland. Wouldn't you think that they would be a bit more sensitive about taking decisions like this at this point of time?
Ivan Lawrence, it was in Sir Patrick Mayhew's gift to decide when he made that announcement. You've denied all day there was a political motive. But don't you agree about the insensitivity that John Hume is referring to?
It would have been quite wrong for the government to have said this man ought to be released for justice reasons, but we're going to postpone his release for political reasons. That would be immoral, and the government hasn't done that and won't do that. And what Patrick Mayhew did was a quasi-judicial decision based upon the reference by a totally independent board that look into life prisoners and the length of sentence that they ought to serve. The fact that somebody's been sent to prison for life doesn't mean in our law that they will stay in prison for life. Sometimes a mercy killer can be let out immediately, sometimes a terrorist must stay for the rest of his days. It depends on the seriousness of the crime. Here what this man did was a soldier on duty, thinking that he was being run down in the night past a checkpoint by somebody who'd stolen a car and might very well be a terrorist, shot in self-defense, but when the vehicle went past him, in 2 or 3 seconds only of madness, he shot into the back of the car, aiming at the driver, and missed and hit, tragically, this young girl.
But the fact is that John Bruton...
Can I just finish? As the Chief Justice of Northern Ireland said, most people would think that this man ought never to have been charged with murder.
But the fact is that it's caused a great deal of disquiet in Dublin, not least that they weren't consulted. Don't you agree that everything at the moment in this delicate peace process that happens in Northern Ireland is tinged with politics?
It's sad that it should be so, but justice must be for everyone, and it must be fair, and it must ignore politics. And here, for what Private Clegg did, 4 years effective imprisonment is at the very top end of the scale. And it's nonsense to say that you can compare his situation with somebody who goes out at the start of the day carrying bombs or weapons with the sole intention of killing or maiming people. That's terrorism of a very high order, and the sentence that justice requires is very much longer than somebody who overreacts under pressure at the spur of the moment when he's doing his duty as a soldier.
John Hume, do you agree with the sentiments coming from Dublin, and particularly coming from Dick Spring today, that without release of prisoners by their government, and our government in fact, then the peace process has little chance?
Well, I think, first of all, that the peace process is a process. And as I have said repeatedly, you know, if we are going to resolve our problem,
We have to come to the stage where we draw a line over the past, because in effect, the instability that gave rise to our situation is a result of the failure of successive governments, not just over years, but over a very long period of time, and politicians, to provide the stability which is based on agreement. And that absence has created the instability which has created a lot of victims. The first victims are the people who have lost their lives, and unfortunately, they can never be brought back. The other victims are security forces, because in a divided society, they're going to be seen as being on one side or the other. The other victims are young people who are sucked into violence. For example, the same regiment that Mr. Clegg belongs to killed 14 people in my streets in one day. I know that they were innocent people, because many of them I knew personally. One of them was my neighbour. One of them lived in the home I was born in. And that acted as a major recruiting agency for young people in those days into organizations. So it's all quite complicated, but the line is that now we're moving to peace. We draw a line over the past and we deal with all these matters, prisoners, etc., sensibly, and deal with all arms sensibly as well, that all these matters be settled to the satisfaction of all sections of our community, and let's have a new beginning. That's the only real philosophy of lasting peace in this part of the world.
Gentlemen both, thank you very much indeed.